Hello, everybody. Hope you can hear me right now. I'm just sorting things out. Okay. Hello. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you for Warwick Student Union for continuously supporting Queer History Warwick and allowing us to be a part of the Campus Pride 2020 program. So, my name is Hannah Ayres, and I am a PhD student at the University of Warwick. So, in my research, I look at queer representation in museums and how queer individuals create, critique, and internalize these representations. So, just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. There will be a Q&A after the talk in which I'll attempt to answer any questions you have. If you could leave these questions via the comments section of the Queer History Warwick live stream rather than the Campus Pride live stream, because the comments don't cross post. So the stream is actually delayed around 30 seconds. So I have Nick Cherryman from Queer History Warwick helping with the session today, and he'll be collecting the questions as we go along. So today I aim to take you all through history, introducing you to individuals who I think can be read through a trans lens. So what I mean by trans here is somebody whose gender identity or expression differs from the gender that they were assigned at birth. This can also include non-binary individuals, genderqueer individuals, all that kind. So I'm going to cover topics such as gender dysphoria, transitioning, gender diversity, sex reassignment surgery, though not in great detail, and drag and cross-dressing. These are topics I see coming under the broad spectrum of trans history, but I'm not claiming that this is everything trans history is. So there's much more history than what I'm going to show you today. And to be honest, when I was doing the research for this, every single time I found a source, I would find another person. So I encourage everybody to share in the comments any trans history that they know of that I don't cover. And hopefully it'll be a big collection of trans history at the end. So I will be also providing a reading list after this talk with the sources that I've used, as well as extra resources for anybody who wants to follow up on this history and find out more. So queer and trans history is often really difficult to find. Queerness throughout history was often not meant to be found because the individuals involved did not want it to be, often because of fear of legal repercussions. On top of this, it's been hidden, erased, uncatalogued, and ignored. So I say this because some of the stories I introduce today are incomplete, potentially because there's no more sources that detail these individuals' lives, or because these sources have yet to be found. Some questions you might have, I might not be able to answer because of this. Also, some of these histories revolve around problematic individuals or difficult events. I think it's still important to look at these histories as they demonstrate a diverse range of trans histories, rather than just looking for positive role models. Although, don't worry, there's definitely some of those in here as well. So, for those of you viewing who might be studying history or know quite a lot about history, I just want to make a quick note on language. So history is constantly being reevaluated and looked at through a modern lens. I think it's important to label this history as trans because, regardless of ahistorical implications, not using modern terminology can often mean that trans individuals are and communities are left without an accessible history. If you would like me to talk more about language use, I can suggest that we save this for the questions and I can talk more about my thoughts there. So before we begin, I really just want to discuss pronouns. So for some of these older histories, I found conflicting evidence and unreliable sources, and as such have made the decision to use the pronouns they, them, theirs for these histories. For some individuals, I've deferred to the most commonly used pronoun or the pronoun that the individual used to identify themselves. So let me just get the images up. I created a little slideshow. Hopefully it works. Oh no, it's not coming up. I don't know what's happening with that. Hang on. Oh no. My little images aren't coming up, which is a shame because I had some quite nice pictures to show everybody. Let's see. I'm using, apologies, I have just learned how to use a lot of this stuff. Okay, I'm just going to carry on. And apologies, and I will share all the pictures that I have on the reading list, and you can look at it and I'll label them. So to begin, I want to showcase one of the oldest forms of potential trans history that I've come across. So this the panel that I was going to talk about comes from the Mesopotamian era, um, from around 1750 BC, around 3,700 years ago. So geographically, Mesopotamia would be where modern day Iraq, Kuwait, Turkey, and Syria is now. So I first came across this object during my study of the British Museum's LGBTQ plus tour, and I'm getting this information from both that tour and Richard Parkinson's book, A Little Gay History. So this panel shows a goddess with wings and talons of a bird of prey. It's potentially thought to be a representation of an aspect of Ishtar, a goddess of attraction and war. It's said that Ishtar had the power to assign gender identity and could, quote, change man into woman and woman into man, end quote. So Ishtar has also been seen to sport a beard when in more warlike poses. So men called the Kogarus were followers of the cult of the goddess, and it seems that they were considered women like men in some instances. So one poem refers to the Kogarus as people, quote, who masculinity Ishtar has turned into femininity to make the people reverend, the carriers of dagger, razor, scalpel, and flint blades, who regularly do forbidden things to delight the heart of Ishtar, end quote. So whilst I cannot say for certain what the forbidden things these men did, I found that potentially it involved castration. But regardless, the Kogarus were regarded as a part of the divinely ordained world order and a part of state religion. So moving swiftly on, we have the next history comes from Rome in 203 to 222 AD, around 1,800 years ago. So, and apologies, I have tried to pronounce this a million times. So Elagabalus, yeah. So that's Elagabalus, has been seen as one of the worst and most depraved holders of the title of Roman Emperor, particularly by contemporaries. Many of their crimes appear to fall under the category of upsetting gender, cultural, and religious norms of Roman society. I should also point out that Elagabalus was 14 years old when they came to power, and so this bad behavior was coming from what we now view as a young teenager. If you want a reference point for this individual, my friend actually said that they reminded them of Joffrey Baratheon from Game of Thrones. So we have quite a few primary sources, so people writing at the time about this individual, but their legitimacy is to be questioned. We have writing from Cassius Dio, a Roman statesman and historian, and Herodian, a minor civil servant that wrote the history of the empire from the death of Marcus. We also have the Augustan history, which is a particularly unreliable source that details unlikely events in this instance. So, for example, at one point it alleges that Elagabalus threw a party in which they suffocated guests by having too many flowers in the room. So the lack of archaeological evidence to back up these written histories has caused some historians to doubt the accounts of Elagabalus and the behavior pertaining to gender and sexuality, and so they claim that these sources were probably created as a way to smear the emperor's reputation. Another way this can be looked at is that evidence of any non-normative behavior was destroyed to uphold more respectable ancient Roman norms. So Elagabalus was an individual that was assigned male at birth. They were raised in Syria, and so they brought many of their customs with them to Rome. This included wearing long flowing robes rather than the more traditional Roman toga, and worshipping their god through expressive dance, which was not viewed as appropriate for the emperor. Elagabalus also wore makeup, and Herodian describes them as appearing in public with, quote, eyes painted and cheeks rouged. Dio recounted an exchange in which an individual called the emperor my lord, and Elagabalus responded with, quote, don't call me a lord, I am a lady, end quote. They also married 5 times, with one of these being to a Vestal virgin. This caused a lot of uproar in Rome, as Vestal virgins were vowed to chastity for religious reasons, and so it was forbidden. It's generally agreed that Elagabalus had sex with lots and lots of people from different genders, and they didn't keep this a secret. At one point, they formed a relationship with the charioteer called Heracles, and they insisted that he be referred to as, quote, the empress's husband, end quote. So Dio describes Elagabalus as having a chamber in the palace that they used to enact fantasies of being a female sex worker. So he said they were, quote, standing all the time naked at the door of it, as the harlots do, and shaking the curtain, which was fastened by gold rings, the while in a soft and melting voice he solicited passers-by, end quote. So it's rumored that Elagabalus offered half the empire to a surgeon that could perform sex reassignment surgery, but this is really based on gossip and speculation. So Greeks and Romans sought to distinguish themselves from Near East civilizations, and one of the ways that they did this is that they did not practice circumcision and actually held a disdain for it. There's sources that claim that Elagabalus was circumcised as part of the requirements for the priestly profession. According to Cassius Dio, castration was one of their fondest desires, and that actually they didn't do it for religious reasons, but out of effeminacy. So Elagabalus took part in the plot to remove their cousin Severus Alexander, but this failed, and so they were eventually killed along with their mother. So I'm now taking you quite swiftly into the Middle Ages, which is a history that I'm more comfortable with. I'm not as comfortable with classical history. And what I mean by comfortable is I used to study early modern history and medieval history. That used to be my area of expertise. So I'm taking you into the Middle Ages with a focus on Calamus ben Calamus, who lived in 1286 to 1328, around 725 years ago. So geographically, from what I can see from their history, they were born in France and later moved to Rome, and then they moved back to France. So Calamus ben Calamus, assigned male of birth, was a Jewish philosopher and translator. They studied philosophy, literature, and medicine, although they don't seem to have practiced the latter. They were considered a reputable writer, but they were more commonly known for their translations of Arabic texts. So Calamus is particularly interesting to us because of a poem that they wrote in the Even Boken. This book is a mixture of biography and satire, and the poem that we're looking at is in the section that's traditionally been seen as more satirical. But this poem details how much Calamus wished to have been born a girl. Here's the section of the poem, quote, Father in heaven, who did miracles for our ancestors with fire and water, in the desert you turned to rock, hard flint to a fountain. Who would then turn me from man to woman? Were I only to have merited this being so graced by your goodness? End quote. So the poem has long been interpreted by many as a way of poking fun at the long list of rules and laws that Jewish people are meant to follow. In the Middle Ages, these laws tended to affect men more, as they were held to a higher standard than women, so academics have interpreted this as Calamus expressing a want to be a woman, to kind of escape the scrutiny under these laws. Some have read the poem as potentially a way to express homosexuality in a covert way by fantasizing about being a woman, but another way to read this poem is quite literally and as an early expression of gender dysphoria and trans identity. So it's difficult to know whether this was just satire or a more literal expression, but nonetheless, many Jewish LGBTQ plus individuals have found solace in this history. So the next history comes from 1394, around 620 years ago. And again, I'm sorry that I don't have the pictures to help visually cue when I'm switching between the different individuals. But John Reichener, also known as Eleanor, was a 14th century sex worker who was arrested in London in December 1394 for performing a sex act with a man, John Britby, whilst dressed as a woman. I will say that the image I'm going to put in the reading list doesn't come from a blog post, but from a no, it doesn't come from, isn't of them, but it comes from a blog post on the Notches blog, which will also be featured on the reading list. So Reichenau's consistent presentation as a woman, as well as them taking up jobs as an embroiderer, sex worker, and barmaid, has led some academics to consider Reichenau as a trans woman. The only known facts of Reichenau's life come from an interrogation made by the Mayor of London. Reichenau was questioned on 2 offences, so prostitution and sodomy, but there's no evidence to suggest that Reichenau was prosecuted for either crime. So I might be throwing a lot of names at you, so I'm going to be clear. Reichenau is the individual we're focusing on, Elizabeth Broderer is the woman she lived with and appeared to work for, and Alice is Broderer's daughter. So during the interrogation, Reichenau described being first dressed as a woman by Elizabeth Broderer at the Bishopsgate house. So here Reichenau was, quote, taught how to sleep with men as a woman and how to get paid for doing so. Although exactly what this entailed, I really can't say, I don't know. But Reichenau was also taught embroidery, which might point to them have been as having been an apprentice of Broderer. So, over the course of the interrogation, Reichenau details many sexual encounters and stated that they had sex with men and women, including priests and nuns. Elizabeth Broderer, the individual who Reichenau was living with, appeared to have a scheme in place involving Reichenau, but the purpose of this seems a little bit unclear. It appears that she would get her daughter Alice to sleep with men at night whilst it was dark and they could not see her. Alice would then leave before it got light, and in the morning, Broderer would tell the client that they had slept with Reichenau. Reichenau would then be in front of the client wearing women's clothes and would be addressed as Eleanor by Broderer. There's a time in which Reichenau had sex with the rector of Thaden Garnon. After having sex with the rector, Reichenau stole 2 gowns from him. He later came to retrieve the gowns, but gave up when Broderer told him that Reichenau was the wife of an important man in town. This would have meant that the rector would have had to sue Reichenau's supposed husband in court for the return of his property, so he gave up. This instance has led some academics to suppose that Broderer was using Reichenau to blackmail men, but others see Reichenau simply as working as a sex worker for Broderer. So our next individual is Joan of Arc, who's a very well-known historical figure that I believe can be read as part of queer and trans history. So many historians have previously dismissed Joan of Arc's wearing of men's clothes as inconsequential or kind of a small part of this history, and some academics have also theorized that perhaps Joan wore men's clothes as protection. But I hope it will become clear in this talk that Joan saw cross-dressing as a sacred duty. So Joan of Arc was born around 1412, just over 600 years ago, and had visions of saints and angels who told her to cut her hair, wear men's clothes, and go to war. Joan awed crowds when she travelled around with the army. She wore a full suit of armour and had hair that was, quote, cropped short and round in the fashion of young men, end quote. So some academics suggested that peasants saw Joan as a part of a tradition that linked cross-dressing and priests in pre-modern Europe. So she also carried a sword in one hand and a banner in the other, with the legend stating that white butterflies followed Joan wherever she went. She helped to crown a king by age 18, and at age 19 she was killed. But she was killed because she refused to give up on wearing men's clothing and was executed by being burnt at the stake on May 30th, 1431. So Joan was captured in battle by the Burgundians, French allies of the English, and during her captivity they called her Hamas, a slur meaning man, woman, or masculine woman. So Charles VII, who Joan had helped to win the crown, did nothing to help Joan despite it being custom to pay the ransom of nobles and knights captured. They found it hard to charge Joan for witchcraft, and so instead they charged her on the supposed heresy that Joan was claiming it was God's will that she was dressed as a man. So Joan swore that God wanted her to wear the clothing, stating, quote, "For nothing in the world will I swear not to arm myself and put on a man's dress," end quote. She outraged judges by continuing to wear men's clothing in court, and after being questioned and getting progressively sicker, she eventually caved and signed a recantation, and was ordered to wear women's clothing again and was sent back to her cell. She was later found to be wearing men's clothing, and when questioned, Joan stated that the voices she had heard had scolded her for her change of heart. So after Joan of Arc was burnt at the stake, the flames were extinguished because they wanted to investigate whether Joan was born a woman. And in 1920, Joan was canonized as a saint and is sometimes known as a trans saint or, quote, holy transvestite, end quote. Her belief that God was the source for her presenting as male is seen as especially inspiring for LGBTQ plus Christians. And I wanted to finish the talk about Joan of Arc with a quote from one of my absolute favorite books. And please, if you get a chance to read it, it's Leslie Feinberg's Transgender Warriors. So, quote, "But I wish I'd been taught the truth about her life and her courage when I was a frightened, confused trans youth. What an inspirational role model. A brilliant transgender peasant teenager leading an army of laborers into battle." End quote. So next we're going to discuss, hang on, give me a second. So, next we're going to discuss Molly Houses, which if you watched our last Facebook Live, Ibuprofene's Drag Through History, that talk also covered Molly Houses, but that talk looked at this history through the lens of drag, whereas I'll be looking at this history through a trans lens. So in my eyes, these two views don't cancel each other out and instead emphasize the vast potential of queer history. So Molly Houses are actually one of my favourite areas of history. Just generally, it provides a look into an early example of queer community that honestly we only have enough sources to scratch the surface of. In the 1700s, around 200 to 300 years ago, Molly houses were like pubs or coffee houses and were places where homosexual men and gender diverse individuals came together to meet. If you called someone a Molly at this time, it was generally implying that they were a part of this scene. So we actually know a lot about this history because authorities began to seek out Mollys in order to prosecute them. So one such individual, Samuel Stevens, a reforming constable, actually offers us a fascinating insight into Molly house culture from 1725. So, quote, I found 40 and 50 men making love to one another, as they called it. Sometimes they would sit on one another's laps, kissing in a lewd manner and using their hands indecently. Then they would get up, dance and make curtsies and mimic the voices of women. Oh, fear, sir, can you serve me, sir? I'll cry, I swear I'll cry out. You're a wicked devil and you've a bold face. I, you little dear toad, come bus. Then they'd hug and play and toy and go out by couples into another room on the same floor to be married, as they called it. End quote. So I'm going to talk about two areas of Molly house history, which I think can be looked at through the lens of trans history. So first I want to cover something that's referred to as mock birth or lying in. So one contemporary source for this comes from Ned Ward, an investigative journalist that's undoubtedly embellished on his stories. However, mock birth is also mentioned in the testimony given throughout trials, as well as throughout the century. So according to James Dalton in 1728, lying in is, quote, when one of them is placed in a chair, and the others attending with napkins, a basin of water, and Susan Guzzle, a gentleman's servant, is the midwife, and with a great deal of ceremony, a jointed baby is brought from under the chair he sits on. End quote. So to clarify, it appears someone was sitting on a chair whilst other individuals were around, with one taking the role of midwife. They would then appear to replicate the process of giving birth, and when they refer to the jointed baby, this is not an actual child, but in some places I read it would have been something like a bag filled with rocks to symbolize a baby. So Richter Norton, the main historian for Molly houses, has a few theories on what this could be, but I'm afraid that his explanations do not satisfy my curiosity. So he compares this moment to an imitative magic called Couvade. So Couvade is also known as sympathetic pregnancy, in which a man feels the symptoms of pregnancy when their partner is expecting a baby. He also compares it to an earlier moment in history in which King James I was on his deathbed, and in an attempt to lift his spirits, a young pig was brought into the room that was dressed as a baby. This baby was then delivered by the mother, one of the court ladies, by the Duchess of Buckingham, who was dressed as a midwife. Norton also states that potentially this could have just been a way to relieve stress through outrageous fun and camp behaviour. I understand that camp is also ahistoric to use here, but I believe Norton uses it to refer to this, the sense of this being a queer parody of sorts. So, though the sources are indeed lacking here, if we take a more literal approach, could these individuals have been trying to perform a ritual of birth in order to understand the practice better, or in a sense try and feel it themselves? Although I've not read it, Nick Cherryman, our moderator today, felt that a parallel could be drawn between this practice and the novel The Handmaid's Tale. So another moment in Molly House culture that I want to speak about is Princess Seraphina. And if you know me well, you've probably heard about this individual. This court case is incredible. In 1732, John Cooper prosecuted Tom Gordon for stealing their clothes. Cooper was a gentleman's servant and a kind of messenger for the Mollys, as well as a bit of a hustler. When character witnesses came out for John Cooper, of which nearly all were cis women, they stated that all her neighbors, they stated that she's actually Princess Seraphina, so much to the shock of the court. The court literally goes, whoa, hold up, what do you mean by that? So they state that all her neighbors knew her as such, some even stating that they'd never known her by any other name. She often borrowed clothes from her female neighbors, attended balls, and dated men. Whilst her day job as John Cooper was as a butcher, there's also evidence that Seraphina worked as a nurse around the neighborhood. It appears Seraphina only had one enemy, a cousin who thought that Seraphina was scandalous, but otherwise this was accepted as normal at a time when actually Molly House culture was being sought out and eradicated. So it's particularly key also to point out that cis women were protecting Seraphina and appear to continue to protect her, as I do not believe she comes up in court trials again. So the trial, which by the way should really be read in full, ended with Gordon, the alleged robber, being acquitted for robbing Seraphina. So our next individual is Chevalier Dion, who was a French diplomat, spy, Freemason, and soldier who fought in the 7 Years' War. They lived from 1728 to 1810, around 270 years ago. Dion had androgynous physical characteristics and appeared publicly as a man and pursued masculine occupations for 49 years. During that time, Dion successfully infiltrated the court of Empress Elizabeth of Russia by presenting as a woman. Rumours also circulated in London that Dion was born a woman, and a betting pool was actually started on the London Stock Exchange. Dion was invited to join but declined, stating that such an examination would be dishonouring regardless of the result. So from 1777, for 33 years, Dion lived as a woman. The Chevalier Dion claimed to have been assigned female at birth and demanded recognition by the government as such. Dion claimed to have been raised as a boy because of inheritance only going to sons, and King Louis XVI and his court complied with the demands, but only if Dion would present as female. So when the king's offer included funds for a new wardrobe of women's clothes, Dion finally agreed. Doctors who examined Dion's body after death discovered, quote, male organs in every respect perfectly formed, end quote, but also female characteristics. A couple of the characteristics described in the certificate was a, quote, unusual roundness in the formation of limbs and, quote, breasts remarkably full, end quote. This has led some to conclude that perhaps Dion was intersex. So, Dr. James Barry is our next individual, and they were assigned female at birth and started out life in 1795, around 225 years ago, as Margaret Ann Bulkley, from an impoverished family in Ireland. His family had connections to the revolutionary General Francisco de Miranda, a Venezuelan radical, through their uncle. And when their uncle died, a plan was hatched in which Barry would go to study medicine in Edinburgh, disguised as a man, and then once Venezuela had been liberated and taken over by General Francisco de Miranda, Barry would go to Venezuela to practice medicine as a woman. General Francisco de Miranda actually didn't succeed in liberating Latin America, and so Barry's plans were dashed. In an interesting turn of events, Barry made the risky decision to become an army surgeon. I say risky here because Barry could easily have been found out by the army and have been reprimanded. He went on to be an army surgeon in Cape Town, the island of St. Helena, Trinidad and Tobago. He ended his career as Inspector General of a military hospital, and he was considered an excellent doctor with great bedside manner. He was also considered quite eccentric and bad-tempered, and many individuals noted his particularly high-pitched voice. And this caused him to be the center of ridicule, and he would often duel individuals who teased him. After one of these duels led to a man's death, the teasing significantly died down. So Barry unfortunately died from dysentery, and when one of his maids was laying him out for a funeral, she discovered Barry had actually been born a woman. And as you might imagine, this caused quite a stir. So some army personnel claimed that they had known all along, and some believed he was born a man that was perhaps underdeveloped. So Barry's doctor, D.R. McKinnon, named him male on the death certificate and stated in a letter, quote, I informed her it was none of my business whether Dr. Barry was male or female. And I thought he might be neither, an imperfectly developed man. But whether Dr. Barry was male, female, or hermaphrodite, I do not know, nor had I any purpose in making the discovery, as I could positively swear to the identity of the body as being that of a person that I had been acquainted with as Inspector General of Hospitals for a period of years. End quote. So the army prevented access to his papers for hundreds of years, and the only reason we really know about Barry at all is because of the work of historian Isabel Ray and Cape Town doctor Michelle Dupreez. So we're now moving on into American history, and we have Lucy Hicks Anderson. So she's an African American woman born in 1886 who was assigned male at birth. When younger, she insisted on wearing dresses to school. Her mother was worried about her behavior and so took her to the doctors, and the doctors actually advised her mother to let Lucy live as a female. So at age 15, she had chosen to go by Lucy and left home. In 1920, at age 34, she married Clarence Hicks and they moved to Oxnard, California, although they later divorced in 1929. She proved herself to be a vital part of the community. She worked as a nanny and as a chef, won awards for her cooking, and proved talented at preparing and hosting dinners for wealthy families. She worked as a nanny and as a chef, won awards for her cooking, and proved talented at Oh no. So she gave generously to charity and threw welcome parties at church for visitors and going away parties for enlisted soldiers. Sorry about the repeat there. She saved money from her jobs and eventually opened a brothel and speakeasy. So in 1944, she married Reuben Anderson, and at one point she was arrested during this time for selling alcohol and was actually eventually bailed out by the town's leading banker who said he needed her for a party that evening. So in 1945, there was an outbreak of venereal disease in Oxnard, and it was rumoured to have come from Lucy's establishment. All employees were ordered to undergo a medical and physical examination, and it was revealed that Lucy had been assigned male at birth. The Ventura Country District Attorney voided her marriage and arrested Lucy for perjury. At her trial, she insisted that any person could appear one gender but actually be another, and stated that, quote, I defy any doctor in the world to prove that I am not a woman, end quote. She was the first trans woman to actually defend her identity in court. So she later told reporters that, quote, I have lived, dressed, acted just what I am, a woman, end quote. So she was placed on 10 years probation as an alternative to prison, and the government later tried and convicted Lucy of fraud when they found out that she had been receiving Anderson's allotment checks as a wife of a member of the US Army. After her release from prison, she was banned from moving back to Oxnard, and she relocated to Los Angeles, where she lived until her death in 1954. So our next individual is Jim McHarris, who was an African-American man who was assigned female at birth, and he was born in 1924. So his parents died early on in his life, and he was raised by two foster parents who openly displayed a distinct dislike for femininity. McHarris would often get away to Jackson to hang out with his friends, and they began to notice that McHarris was not only attracted to women, but that he liked to present and live as a man. He transitioned in his early teens and from 1939 began to move around the US, living in areas such as Memphis and Chicago, and he worked as a short order cook, cab driver, gas station attendee, mechanic, shipyard worker, and preacher. When living in Kosciuszko, he was pulled over by police at a traffic stop. Officers stated that his car had improper lighting and that he also had whiskey in his car. He was arrested and subjected to a pat-down in which his gender assigned at birth was revealed. Jim was later ordered to prove his gender and was put through unnecessary and intrusive exams, in one of which he was forced to strip off in front of the judge and arresting officers. The reveal caused a stir in town and subjected him to backlash. He was given the option of paying an $100 fine or doing 30 days in jail at the prison farm. When serving his sentence, he was dressed in men's clothes, working in a prison kitchen, but was housed with female prisoners. After getting out, he moved to Jackson and stated in a 1954 Ebony article that, quote, "I ain't done nothing wrong and I ain't breaking no laws," end quote. So, hang on. Our next history is not about a specific individual, but I wanted to include it because actually I hadn't heard of this event before, and so I wanted to help shine a light on it. So the Compton's cafeteria riots occurred in August 1966 in San Francisco. So this is one of the first LGBT-related riots in the US history, preceding Stonewall by 3 years. It also marked the beginning of trans activism in San Francisco. So the Compton's cafeteria was not an LGBT plus restaurant or bar in the way that Stonewall Inn was. So in the 1960s, the Compton's cafeteria staff began to harass trans individuals who went to the restaurant. They felt that trans customers were, quote, loitering, and that it was causing them to lose business. They went on to implement a service fee directed at trans individuals and harassed them to get them to leave the restaurant. The situation escalated and the staff began to call police on trans individuals who came into the restaurant. In response to the police arrests being made, the trans community launched a picket of the Compton's cafeteria. Although the picket was unsuccessful, it was one of the first demonstrations against police violence towards trans people in the San Francisco area. So on the first night of the riot, the management of Compton's called the police when some trans customers were being a little boisterous, is what they said. So the incident began when a transgender woman resisted arrest by throwing coffee at a police officer. Susan Stryker, a trans historian who did a documentary about this history, stated that the cafeteria then erupted. So the riot began with dishes and furniture being thrown and restaurant windows being smashed. The fighting began to pour into the streets and police called for reinforcements. A police car had its windows broken out and a sidewalk newsstand was burnt down. The next night, more trans people, drag queens and kings, and other members of the LGBT community joined a picket of the cafeteria, which actually no longer was allowing trans individuals back in. The demonstration ended with the restaurant's new windows again being smashed. So the exact date of the riot is really unknown because the police records no longer exist and the riot was not covered by any newspapers. So moving on, I actually don't think I can do a trans history talk in the month of Pride without talking about my last two individuals, so Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. So Marsha P. Johnson was an extremely well-liked activist, sex worker, drag performer, and was a central figure in the gay liberation movement that was sparked by the Stonewall riots. She has been praised for her work on social and economic justice, for working on behalf of homeless young people that have been ostracized from their families for being gay, as well as gender non-conforming. And she also did work on behalf of AIDS patients. She was also a model for Andy Warhol, and she suffered bad mental health for the majority of her life was also effectively homeless. So Johnson was a key figure in the disturbances that followed the police raid at the Stonewall Inn early in the morning of June 28, 1969. There's much myth-making around Stonewall, but it's said that Johnson was one of the main individuals resisting the police. So she was 23 at the time. In 1970, Johnson joined Rivera and founded Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR, to advocate for young transgender people. They also helped to house, clothe, and feed trans people from a tenement at 213 East 2nd Street. So many trans individuals have come to hail Johnson as a pioneering hero. The term transgender was not widely used in Johnson's lifetime, but she usually used female pronouns for herself, but also referred to herself as gay, a transvestite, or simply as a drag queen. Susan Stryker had this to say, quote, Marsha P. Johnson could be perceived as the most marginalized of people. Black, queer, gender non-conforming, poor. You might expect a person in such a position to be fragile, brutalized, beaten down, but instead Marsha had this joie de vivre, a capacity to find joy in a world of suffering. She channeled it into political action and did it with a kind of fierceness, grace, and whimsy, with a loopy, absurdist reaction to it all. End quote. So Johnson's death was tragic and also shrouded in mystery. Police officially ruled her death a suicide, but Johnson's friends and other members of the community insisted that this seemed really unlikely. So in 2012, activist Mariah Lopez succeeded in getting the case reopened by the NYPD, and they reclassified Johnson's cause of death from suicide to undetermined. In 2016, Victoria Cruz also tried to get the case reopened and succeeded in getting access to previously unreleased documents and witness statements. Some of this work was filmed by David France for the 2017 documentary The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson, which I recommend checking out on Netflix if you'd like to know more. So Sylvia, moving on to Sylvia Rivera, she was a Latina American woman who has a diverse and complex background. She was poor, trans, a drag queen, a person of color, a former sex worker, and someone that experienced drug addiction, incarceration, and homelessness. She became a radical gay and trans activist in the 1960s and 70s, and Rivera not only fought for gay and trans rights, but also racial, economic, and criminal justice issues. So she participated in the Stonewall riots at 17 years old and later co-founded the Gay Liberation Front. She later also established STAR with her friend Marsha P. Johnson, and as just mentioned, this group worked on providing housing and support to homeless queer youth and sex workers in Lower Manhattan. So I will say, if you're particularly interested in Rivera, I've put the first episode of the Making Gay History podcast on the reading list, in which the host interviewed Rivera, so I really recommend checking that out. There was some tension around the gay rights bill, as Rivera felt like really betrayed when this bill, which took 17 years to become New York law in 1986, excluded the rights of the trans community. She stated, quote, "They have a little backroom deal without inviting Miss Sylvia and some of the other activists to this backroom deal with these politicians. The deal was, you take them out, we'll pass the bill." End quote. Rivera here was saying that these deals were made with the gay, middle-class white men, as well as lesbian feminists that did not represent her interests. Angered by their lack of inclusion, Rivera delivered her "You'll Better Quiet Down" speech in 1973, New York City, at the Christopher Street Liberation Day rally. So amid boos from the crowd, she delivered statements such as, quote, "You all tell me, go and hide my tail between my legs. I will no longer put up with this shit. I have been beaten down, I have had my nose broken, I have been thrown in jail, I have lost my job, I have lost my apartment for gay liberation, and you all treat me this way. What the fuck's wrong with you all? Think about that." End quote. So feeling betrayed by the movement she fought for, she left STAR and disappeared from activism for around 20 years. She later came back to continue to fight for trans issues and take part in conversations around gay marriage and LGBTQ plus communities serving in the military. So on the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, Rivera participated in New York City's Pride Parade and had this to say, quote, "The movement had put me on the shelf, but they took me down and dusted me off. Still, it was beautiful. I walked down 58th Street and the younger ones were calling from the sidewalk, 'Sylvia, Sylvia, thank you, we know what you did.' But after that, I went back on the shelf. It would have been really wonderful if the movement took care of its own." End quote. So before I finish off the talk by discussing the Museum of Transology, I want to talk about trans lives in the public eye. So over the last few years, trans lives have become more visible, though often in ways that have been exaggerated by the media. I am deeply aware that this visibility has also brought out horrendous transphobia, but today I don't really want to focus on that. That's not what this talk is about. So instead, I want to use this time to shout out more positive examples that I've recently seen, as well as academics you can refer to for trans history. This isn't the only example I could have pulled out. I just think it's quite interesting. So I want to talk about Pose, which is a TV series that talks about New York City's ballroom scene from the 1980s. Unfortunately, I didn't cover ball culture really in my talk, mainly because that could honestly be its own talk. But if you want to see a more stylized telling of the history of ball culture, I would check out Pose. yeah, so the show has trans and non-binary actors, of which many are individuals of color, playing the main characters. So this includes India Moore, MJ Rodriguez, and Dominic Jackson, and much more. So Janet Mock, one of the producers on the show, wrote an article about being the first trans woman of color to write, direct, and produce a television series. And she stated, quote, "My hope is that my work on Pose does more than merely make history. I want to make people feel their feel their way through our characters whose experiences have for so long been othered, invisibilized, and sidelined." End quote. So I also want to say that there are a lot of fantastic individuals that have helped bring to light trans history and trans lives, and that have helped to provide a basis for this talk to even be written. So this includes the work of Susan Stryker, Jack Halberstam, Lois Stone, Leslie Feinberg, Kate Bornstein, Riley C. Snorton, and many, many more, which you can all find on the reading list. So the last thing I want to talk about today before we move on to the Q&A is the Museum of Transology. So this project started before I came into contact with it as a small exhibition in a pub in Brighton. The exhibition grew so popular that it actually got in the way of the business, with people unable to get to the bar. The Museum of Transology is a collection of objects donated by trans individuals and is the largest collection in the UK. Each object was donated with the tag attached that stated why the individual had chosen to donate the object in question. The idea was to reject the capitalist notion of collection within museums by accepting every single item donated, and they also wanted to display objects that helped to emphasize the everyday experiences of trans individuals. In 2017, the Museum of Transology was put on display at Brighton Museum and Art Gallery, and originally meant to last 3 months. This fascinating exhibition lasted until early 2020 and now resides in the Bishopsgate Institute archive. And if you ever want to look at it, I would get in touch with that archive. So I want to finish with this exhibition, as I believe it represents the ability for trans individuals to collect and write their histories right now. So as you might have seen through this talk, trans history is numerous but difficult to find. There's been attempts to erase, rewrite, and hide queer history more generally, and I hope this talk today has allowed you to see there's a long line of gender diverse, non-conforming, queer and trans lives in the past, and I really hope that perhaps I was able to show you something that you've not heard of before. So that's the end of my talk. I hope you enjoyed. I have not looked at any of the comments yet, but I am going to just take a 2-minute break. And in that time, if you want to ask any questions, feel free to write them in the comments. But it's only going to be like 2 minutes. One question to answer. But somebody said, did you come across any accounts and stuff about Miss Major? So Ari, Marcia, and Sylvia. And actually, I have not. When I was doing this talk, I looked more in the early modern medieval 1800s kind of area, because I think personally older histories are harder to find in queer history. But I can definitely find and add some stuff to the reading list after this. So yeah. I don't think there's any more questions. I'm just gonna get the confirmation from Nick. And there's the 30-second delay. Hang on. Also, somebody said I didn't mention the documentary Paris is Burning for the 1980s ballroom scene. So I recommend highly checking that out also. Yeah. Okay, cool. No more questions. Thank you everybody for coming today, listening to this talk. It will also be available afterwards to sharing. We also just created a YouTube channel, so I'll provide the list on all these different places. So yeah, thank you.